السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا بكم أعزائنا طلبة المرحلة الثانية في كلية طب الأسنان جامعة بغداد في تكملة سلسلة محاضرات مادة صناعة الأسنان. Our lecture today is the anatomy and the physiology of temporomandibular joint, and I'm my lecturer Mustafa Mehdi. What is the temporomandibular joint? The temporomandibular joint is the joint of the jaw. It consists of the joint between the temporal bone and the mandible. Its name derived from the two bones which form the joint, which are the temporal bone and the mandible. Here the mandible and here the temporal bone. Temporomandibular joint, or the articulation of the TM joint, is the articulating of the condylar process of the mandible and the interarticular disc with the mandibular glenoid fossa of the temporal bone. The consistency of the temporomandibular joint consists of the mandibular or glenoid fossa, and the condylar or the head of the mandible, and the articular disc or the meniscus, and the synovial cavity. This is the four contents of the temporomandibular joint. We can see in this sketch the glenoid fossa, the articular disc or meniscus, and this is the articular eminence. This is the head of the mandible, which is the condylar head, and this is the synovial cavity, which is of two compartments: the upper compartment between the articular disc and the glenoid fossa, and the lower compartment between the articular disc and the condylar head of the mandible. What are the difference between the temporomandibular joint and other joint in the body? We have many difference between the temporomandibular joint and other joint of the body. Start from that the TM joint has articular disc, which is completely divides the joint spaces into upper and lower joint compartment. This is the superior joint cavity, this is the inferior joint cavity, this is the articular disc, and this is the condylar head, and this is the glenoid fossa, so that we can see that the articular disc completely divide the joint space into upper and lower compartment, and this is unique for the temporomandibular joint, and there is no such a joint in other part of human body. Also, the other difference between the TM joint and other joint in the human body is the TM joint is the glenoarthroidal joint, means that it has two movement, which is hinge action or rotational movement, and slide action or translation movement. Also, the relationship of the teeth affect the relationship of the articulating compartment. The gliding surfaces of the teeth affect the movement of the TM joint, especially in the gliding movement. The difference is that the mandibular is the only bone in the body hinged on both ends that is not capable of independent movement at one end, means that the two heads of the mandible, when move, they move together, and there is no ability to move only one head of the condyle, and the other head is still in a static relation. From the other part of the temporomandibular joint is the ligament that affect the movement of the mandible. It consists of three ligaments: the temporomandibular and the capsular ligament, the sphenomandibular ligament, and the stylomandibular ligament. We can see that its name derived from its attachment at its insertion. The temporomandibular ligament or the capsular ligament started from the temporal bone and end in the condylar head. Sphenomandibular ligament starts from the sphenoid bone and end in the mandibular TM joint, and the stylomandibular started from the styloid process. The function of this ligament is stabilizing the joint by limiting its movement. We can imagine and understand that the ligament action is stabilizing and limitation of the movement of the TM joint. Ligament does not stretch, but it could be elongated. Also, the elongation of the ligament could compromise the normal joint function. We can see there. This is the sphenoid bone. This is the styloid process. This is the stylomandibular ligament started from the styloid bone and with the mandible. This is the mandibular angle. This is the sphenomandibular ligament start from the sphenoid bone and with the mandible. And this is the posterior aspect of the articular capsule. And this is the capsular ligament. And this is the lateral ligament, which is apart from the capsular ligament. So we can understand that its name derived from its insertion or its origin and its insertion. Also, we can see from this lateral view that this is the styloid process. This is the stylomandibular ligament. This is the sphenomandibular ligament. This is the sphenoid bone, and this is the mandible. So sphenomandibular ligament, and this is the lateral ligament. This is the articular capsule. This is the condylar head. This is the coronoid process of the mandible, and there's other part of the skull bone. This is the zygomatic arch and the zygomatic bone. So we can see that the TM joint is completely encapsulated by the ligament. نجي للموضوع الثاني في المحاضرة اللي هو المسل that control the movement of the mandible. تقسم إلى ثلاثة مجاميع رئيسية اللي هي opening muscles والclosing muscle and the gliding muscle. بالنسبة للopening muscle عندنا السبراهايويد muscle، البلاتيزما، الانفراهايويد muscle and the lateral pterygoid muscle اللي هي المصل الوحيدة اللي تكون قريبة على الhead of the mandible. بالنسبة للclosing muscle عندنا الماسيتر، عندنا التمبوراليس muscle and the medial pterygoid muscle. مثل ما تلاحظون انه الماسيتر and temporalis muscle هي large size muscle as we need more force in closing movement. وعندنا المجموعة الثالثة اللي هي gliding muscles اللي هي lateral pterygoid muscles. مثل ما نشوف هذا الدايجرام، عندنا الماسيتر muscle، temporalis muscle، الاكشن مالتها هو closing the mandible، lateral pterygoid assist and aid in the lateral chewing movement, and the digastric muscle or the infrahyoid or suprahyoid muscle act as opening action for the mandible. مقسمة عندنا بهذا الدايجرام بالنسبة للماسكولار اكشن. بالنسبة للopening function هي lateral pterygoid and digastric anterior belly of digastric muscle. بالنسبة للclosing action اللي هو الماسيتر muscle temporalis muscle and medial pterygoid. بالنسبة لحركة البروتروجن هي forward sliding of the mandible. We have the masseter muscle, the superficial part of the masseter muscle, lateral pterygoid and the medial pterygoid muscle. بالنسبة للتروجن movement we have the temporalis muscle اللي هي posterior band of the temporalis muscle and the digastric muscle. For the gliding group we have the masseter, temporalis on the same side and medial and lateral pterygoid on the other side. Here we have the mandibular axis and the mandibular movements. For the mandibular axis, there are three axes around which the mandibular movement takes place in horizontal direction, sagittal and the frontal planes. Classification of the mandibular movement. We have three classifications. The first one based on the dimension involved in the movement, the second one based on the type of movement, and the third one based on the extent of the movement. Based on the dimension of the movement, we have the most mandibular movement occur around three principal dimensions: transverse, vertical, and sagittal axis. The horizontal axis of the mandible, or the hinge axis, an imaginary line around which the mandibular may rotate within the sagittal planes. We can imagine this rod passing through the head of the condylar head of the mandible, and the mandible rotate around this axis. This is the horizontal axis of the mandible. The sagittal axis of the mandible, imaginary anterior-posterior line around which the mandible may rotate when viewed in the frontal plane. We can imagine this rod passing anterior-posterior through one head of the condyle, and the mandible make this movement in the frontal plane. Vertical axis of mandible, imaginary line around which the mandible may rotate through the horizontal plane. Based on the mandibular movement may be divided into two types: basic movement and functional movements. Why we have to understand the mandibular movement? We have to understand and to imagine the mandibular movement for better understand of the various aspects of occlusion, and for arrangement of the artificial teeth, and for the selection and adjustment of the recording device or articulators. For better understanding of the mandibular movement, let's see this video. For understanding of the mandibular movement, we can see this is the maximum mandibular opening or maximum mouth opening. Return to the right lateral and move to the centric occlusion, then return to the left lateral, and then opening to the maximum opening, and return back to the centric occlusion. This is the lateral movement to the right and to the left. This is diagram represent the extent of the mandibular movement. From the horizontal view, we can see the right lateral movement, the protrusive movement, the mandible move anteriorly, the left lateral movement, and return back to the centric relation of occlusion, and then to the centric occlusion or maximum intercuspation. This is from the horizontal view. From the sagittal view, we can see the basic mandibular movement. This is the maximum opening. This is the terminal hinge movement. This is centric relation of occlusion, and this is the centric occlusion. This is the maximum protrusive. This is the maximum protrusive. So this represents the movement of the mandible, recording from the tip of the lower incisor teeth. So the mandibular movement is determined by the anatomy of the condylar head and the glenoid fossa and the cusp tip and cut valley or the occlusal scheme, and by the action of the muscle of mastication and the ligament that attach the TM joint in position. For the summarization of the plane of movement, we can see the sagittal plane of movement, and this is the frontal plane of movement, and the horizontal plane of movement for better understanding of the mandibular movement. For the rotation and translation movement, or the basic movement of the mandible that occur at the level of the TM joint, the rotational movement occurs in the lower compartment of the TM joint between the superior surface of the condyle and the inferior surface of the articular disc, where the translatory or gliding movement occur in the upper compartment of the TM joint. As we mentioned before, that the TM joint is unique joint in the body that have two compartments separated by the articular disc, so that the translatory movement or gliding occur between the upper compartment, between the superior surface of the articular disc and the inferior surface of the glenoid fossa. For the functional movements, all the mandibular movements except the terminal hinge movement, they are a combination of rotation and translation movement, most frequently, and are referred to as being a functional movement. And the functional movement include the opening and the closing movement, symmetrical forward and backward movement, and asymmetrical sidewise movement or lateral movement. This is the end of the lecture. Thank you for your listening.